Hello, folks, and welcome to All Over the Place. My name is Dara Star Tucker. I'm so glad that you've decided to join me for this episode on affirmative action. I'm happy to be talking to one of my favorite mutuals, Mr. Qasim Rashid, who is a human rights lawyer. We're going to get into a really interesting conversation around the issue of affirmative action. Just a few housekeeping things before I bring you this episode that is being done in partnership with a radio station that I work for in California called KJLH in the LA area. First of all, if you're going to be in LA around the 11th of May, I will be a part of their Women's Empowerment event that's happening at the Long Beach Convention Center. At 10:30 a.m. on the 11th of May, I will be hosting a roundtable discussion with several representatives from the medical field on Black maternal mortality rates. I'll be talking to Ms. Gwendolyn Manning, who's the Black Infant Health Program Coordinator for the Long Beach Health and Human Services Department. I'll be talking to Councilwoman Jody Ricks-Audie and LA Councilwoman Heather Hunt. We also have another very special guest that we're working on. We're still waiting to get confirmation about that. But if you are going to be in Southern California, anywhere around that date, I would love to have you for that event. You can register for this event by going to kjlhradio.com and getting your free tickets there. So I really hope to see you if you are anywhere in the area. And as usual, I want to remind you all that the best way that you can support the work that I do is by becoming a patron. You can go to patreon.com/Dara Star Tucker. That's Dara with one R and Star with two. Most people pledge about $5 a month. Some people maybe $10 a month to ensure that this work can continue through all of the creative ups and downs. Everyone knows what freelancing is like. Those of us who do this kind of work, we are freelancers, and your support as patrons means the world to us. So if you enjoy the breakdown, if you enjoy the radio show, if you enjoy the podcast, if you are a regular listener or consumer of the work that I put out there, go to patreon.com/Dara Star Tucker and sign up today. And don't forget, we have breakdown merch on the website, darastartucker.com. I will also be in Philly on the 21st of July at a club called South. We will have the actual ticket link for that really soon. As soon as it goes up on the website, I will share that with you all. So I'm going to send you right over to this episode now on affirmative action with Qasim Rashid. I have an interview this week with him, and then we'll do part 2 on voting rights next week. And this is one of those episodes that's really exciting for me because it is so different from the radio version of this. As you all know, my radio show is 25 minutes long. It has to have a hard stop time. But for you guys, I get to share the full-on interview. I don't have to cut anything out. Conversations that I have with Qasim always go to some very interesting places. He has a way of giving some very specific examples, and a lot of those I had to cut out, and I hated to lose a lot of the flavor. There were some jokes and things that he threw in. All kinds of little nuggets that I had to cut out for the radio show because it really has to be a tight 25 minutes. But for you guys, you get to hear the fullness of this conversation exactly the way that it was intended for you to hear it. These are great conversations. I hope you enjoy them. If so, give the podcast a rating, give it a like, give it a thumbs up, write a short review if you can. It helps us in the rankings. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you all next week. Here's the episode. Hi there, folks, and welcome to The Breakdown. I'm Dara Star Tucker. I'm so glad to be joined today by Mr. Qasim Rashid. He is a human rights lawyer who is based in Chicago. He has so many, when we started to talk about what this episode might be about, there were so many different directions that I was considering going in because he has such a wide knowledge base and has been such a wonderful advocate for people of color across the spectrum. And so what we really want to focus on today are the attacks on affirmative action. So I'm going to let you tell the folks a little bit more about yourself, Qasim, and then we're going to get into hopefully a robust discussion because these issues are very much at the forefront of what is happening politically and are motivating a lot of people to go to the ballot this year. So Qasim, welcome to The Breakdown. And would you tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Dara, it's always a privilege to get to converse with you. And I still remember watching, I think it was your Sesame Street breakdown on TikTok. And I was like, who is this woman? And I need to be her friend. Like, this is incredible. And every single one is just a home run. So you're absolutely an inspiration. I'm an attorney who works on human rights issues. I've been a human rights attorney my entire career, particularly focused on women who are survivors of domestic and sexual violence. Racial injustice issues, one of the core cases I'm working on right now is a small Christian community in Virginia who is comprised of Black and Indigenous Christians who had their ancestral cemetery taken and razed, and we're filing a lawsuit there. And so a lot of the work I focus on is ensuring that we have representation in the halls of power. And a lot of the scholarship I've written revolves around recognizing that the policies that we have today are not spontaneous or isolated, but a direct reflection of the horrific policies we've had in the past. And I'm a big fan of Dr. Michelle Alexander, Dr. Ibram Kendi, when they talk about it's not enough to be not racist, we need to be anti-racist and enact anti-racist policies to undo the harms that have been done and to build positive progress going forward. And as you know, one of the best ways to do that is through communication, through mass messaging, through storytelling, and that's what I try to do. And the best part about it is that it connects you to good people like Dara Star Tucker. So I'm grateful to be here.
Wonderful. And Qasim, would you mind telling the audience a little bit about your cultural background? Kind of tell us where you come from and how that influences and informs the work that you do.
I'm an immigrant from Pakistan. I was about 4 or 5 years old when my family immigrated here initially to DC for a couple of years and then to the Chicagoland area where I lived throughout my entire childhood in undergrad and got married, worked, we had our first child here. And I think when you're an immigrant of color, when you are a faith minority in a country like the United States, you learn very quickly that you are suddenly the spokesperson for all people brown, all people Muslim, especially in a post 9/11 America. Suddenly you are the spokesperson for all that there ever was and would be. And I think that informed me early on about the need to be engaged and not be passive, not be reactive, but to be proactive. And, any person of color, any Black person, any Indigenous person will tell you that that's kind of the way this country has been, right? As an immigrant, I had to learn that growing up. I was fortunate. I was extraordinarily fortunate. It's one of the best gifts ever given to me is that my earliest teachers, my earliest mentors at the mosque in particular were Black and Indigenous Muslims. And I took for granted, because I was so young and didn't know any other way, the wisdom they were teaching me. And it wasn't only through a formal class session, although those existed as well. But, you sit down with those aunties and uncles and having a conversation over breakfast, over coffee, over dinner, that now in my 40s, I think back, and I think back and I get emotional thinking about it, because, what I saw at the time as an innocent conversation was actually me being mentored and taught about history in ways that, Harvard couldn't teach you right now. And so I've been very lucky in my life that I've had teachers and mentors who are God's gift to humanity. And my goal is to try to imbibe the work that they did and elevate the work they did and keep pushing forward so that we can have a more equitable and just future. That's what my faith teaches me. It's what my upbringing has taught me. And it's what I hope to continue to push forward to the next generation.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate your advocacy. I think sometimes, at least in my estimation, from my point of view, there seems to be some, a bit of animosity. That might be too strong a word, but there seems to be a lack of understanding, at the very least, between immigrant communities and the Black community. And I know that oftentimes the success of certain immigrant communities can be thrown in our faces as Black people, as if to say, well, they came here and it's always with nothing in their pockets. They had $2 in their pockets and absolutely no place to live. And within a generation, they are accomplishing all of these things. And so why not you? And it can be difficult sometimes with the work that I do when I'm engaging with people like that. And I really try not to engage with time wasters very much these days. But in the past, I have engaged in these conversations, and it can be kind of difficult to do that without, I think, being offensive to the immigrant community, and speaking about the realities and the differences that exist between immigrants and people who are Black people who are descendants of enslaved people in the United States. So can you speak to that
Yeah.
just a little bit when you hear that? And I don't know how often you come in, up against those sorts of arguments, but what's your response to that kind of an accusation?
This is why I'm grateful about the teachers that I had growing up. Look, my father got here with $30 in his pocket. And to anyone who says, well, look at you, you're an attorney now and you're accomplished and your father got it with $30, so why can't Black people do the same thing? My response to them is threefold. One, you're telling me you're ignorant of history, because you missed the point, first of all, that Asian Americans like me were only able to immigrate because Black civil rights leaders said none of us are free until all of us are free, and helped pass immigration reform. Because as of 1924 and well before then, all Asian immigration was banned. Two, it tells me that you're making a false equivalence, because having $30 in your pocket is still infinitely better than suffering through 300 years of genocide and enslavement. Infinitely better. So if your argument is that, look, your dad only had $30 and now you're successful, why can't Black people? What that tells me is that you are devaluing the harm done, or ignoring and sanitizing and whitewashing the harm done for 300 years of generational genocide and institutional slavery, and the lasting legacies of those harms done as well. And three, it tells me that you're enabling white supremacy. You're becoming a scapegoat to perpetuate the harm done. We saw the recent repeal of affirmative action at the Supreme Court level on the backs of Asian Americans who allowed themselves to be scapegoated into advancing this white supremacist construct, ignoring the fact. And you can tell I'm getting fired up about this, because I get so angry when Asians, South Asians, Asians of all stripes, allow themselves to become the mule for white supremacy. Because when you look at the facts, affirmative action, the single demographic most benefited, who has most benefited from affirmative action, more than Black people, Latinos, Indigenous, and Asians combined, are white women. And yet it's being portrayed as a handout to Black people, which is not only wrong. The second reason why it infuriates me is because Harvard, let's take them as the example, there's outrage that I think the student body was 8% Black, right? Never mind that Black people are 13, 14% of the US population. 8% Black people at Harvard is considered offensive. But worse than that, legacy admissions. 43% of white students at Harvard are there due to legacy admissions, non-merit means. And the argument is, well, but they certainly would have qualified on academics on themselves, right? No. A recent Washington Post study found that 75% of white legacy students at Harvard would not have qualified on merit alone, would not have qualified on their grades alone. And so for people to get upset at affirmative action allowing equal access to non-white males, while ignoring this grotesque injustice of allowing an absurd amount of unqualified white students, what it tells me is that you're not actually protecting education or academia, you're protecting white supremacy. So when folks bring up that argument, to me, it's a red flag. It's a flashing neon sign that tells me that they don't actually care, or they don't actually know, or they're not actually willing to have the self-respect to not be used as a mule. And I have a very easy time dismissing those arguments because they're not grounded in fact or reality. And I think that's where, as an Asian American, I take it upon myself to make sure I'm educating my fellow Asians to say, hey, we cannot allow ourselves to be scapegoated by these white supremacist policies, because guess what? We can rub and scrub our skin as hard as we want. We're not going to be white. And when push comes to shove, we're going to be thrown into the Southern strategy mentality, just like Black people are. Let's have solidarity for justice, not become a tool of white supremacy ourselves.
I love to hear you talk about this stuff, Qasim, because you are so organized in the way that you present this information, and you're very engaged with the idea of debate and an argument, and it really takes being able to create these succinct arguments. to know how to engage people who are almost professional debaters. They come into your comments section, and I'm sure you deal with them enough, and they're ready. They come locked and loaded and prepared with these ridiculous arguments. And oftentimes, you know that there's something fundamentally wrong with what people have to say, but you don't quite know. For people like me who are just, I'm not out there. Qasim ran for office over the past year and a half, probably is the length of that campaign. In his native Chicago, he ran for Congress.
That's right.
In Chicago. And so I know in order to be prepared for a race like that, you really have to be well studied, and you have to know exactly how to present. I don't want to use the word arguments, but you have to know how to present your point of view, and to be able to do that very succinctly, very quickly, and very clearly. So I appreciate hearing you talk about these kinds of things. And if you haven't done a video about that, Qasim, just that question about Black descendants of enslaved people versus immigrants, I would love to see just a little 2-minute video or whatever, just kind of a real quippy sort of video that enables us to come back against that argument. But really, what I want to talk about, because first of all, affirmative action has been shot down. We know that affirmative action, specifically race-based affirmative action, has now been shot down by the Supreme Court. And this was a case that was brought by, if I'm not mistaken, Edward Blum. I have a breakdown that is coming down the pike on a guy named Edward Blum, who has been very active with engaging the Supreme Court about a variety of issues. And this guy does not like race-based affirmative action. The other case, and it's slipping my mind right now, help me, Qasim, back in 2013, the Voting Rights Act, which we're going to talk about a little bit later.
Shelby versus Holder, yeah.
Shelby versus Holder, I believe he was behind that as well. And so can you, I guess, help us understand, first of all, I kind of want to ask a two-part question, and we'll, just kind of work our way through this. Help us understand, first of all, why is affirmative action necessary to begin with? I'll just leave it there, and I'll ask the other part kind of after you've had the chance to respond to that.
Absolutely. And so we have to look at what even ignited affirmative action. And it starts from this point, this fundamental point, that throughout American history, despite our founding document saying all men all people are created equal, that has never been applied in any kind of meaningful way. And because it was never applied in any kind of meaningful way, we saw policies entrenched to ensure a segregation of not just classes, but also economic classes, gender classes. There's a great Family Guy clip, actually, not to make it too trivial, where Peter's ancestor arrives at Quahog and says, "We're going to call this place America. There's going to be freedom for all people, except Black people, gays, Jews, Muslims, anyone not white." And I mean white. I don't mean like Irish white. I mean like Anglo-Saxon white. In fact, no rights for anybody. It's such a great clip because it truly does break down what all men are created equal actually meant in practical application. And so even after the Civil War, you have the 13th and 14th Amendment passed, which in the backdrop of pre-Civil War, the Dred Scott decision was the last real opportunity for the Supreme Court to say, oh, wait, Black people are human beings as well. But written by Justice Taney, the Supreme Court decision said, nope, Black people are subhuman. They don't apply to the constitutional principles of all people are created equal. And a lot of scholars say that that's actually the last straw that eventually ignited the Civil War as well. Now, a lot of folks don't realize that post-Civil War, the 13th and 14th Amendments were intended to ensure Black people got equal access to basic human. And hence you had the Civil Rights Acts of 1875, not 1965, 1875, which enacted that and said, okay, great, now Black people should have equal access to existence. Well, the Supreme Court in 1883 ruled 8-1 that nope, 13th and 14th Amendments don't actually mean Black people have equal rights. And so therefore they codified Jim Crow laws, Black codes, and that scourge of perpetual enslavement by any other name continued through the 1960s until the 1965 Civil Rights Acts finally said, no, Black people actually are equal human beings and should have equal access. All that backdrop to get to affirmative action, and that affirmative action was then signed into law actually a little bit before the Civil Rights Acts were passed, that basically said, not that we're going to accept unqualified people because they're Black. The exact opposite. It said that we are going to ensure that qualified Black people and women and Latinos, etc., have equal access to education and to employment. And that's the key distinction that I want to make. Affirmative action was never about accepting unqualified people for jobs that they're not qualified for or that they haven't earned. It was always about ensuring that qualified Black people could also have access to jobs that they've earned. That's fundamentally what it's always been about.
Mm-hmm.
The unqualified admission that you're thinking of is Jared Kushner getting into Harvard because his father wrote a large check. It's George Bush getting into Yale because his father wrote a large check. Those are the legacy admissions. That's the unqualified admission that you're talking about. It was never a sense of affirmative action. And even to this day, HBCUs, which were enacted, which were built specifically because even after the Civil War, white supremacists said, no, we don't want Black children to even learn to read.
Mm-hmm.
So HBCUs are set up to ensure that Black children can have education access. Even to this day, HBCUs have double the number of white students as Ivy League schools have Black students. And that is the point, that when we look at what affirmative action was supposed to do, it was simply supposed to say, hey, we have had 300 years of systemic, overt racial disenfranchisement against Black people. Now we need to make a more conscious effort to say that we are going to ensure that qualified Black people, a qualified physician, a qualified lawyer, a qualified engineer, has the same access as unqualified white people had for centuries, right? And so I'll close my rant with this point that, what's that old saying? And forgive me, I can't remember the attribution, but when you've had privilege your entire life, equality feels like oppression. It's that view of so-called oppression from the mere suggestion of equality that you have these right-wing zealots like Ed Blum go out and say, nope, even mere equality is, I feel oppressed and we can't allow it to happen. That's how we got to where we are today.
Yeah. And I think Edward Blum, he sees himself as some sort of a justice warrior for equality in this weird, twisted way. Because I've watched several interviews with him and putting the breakdown together on him that I did. It's very interesting to hear his mindset, because in his own estimation, I don't even think he sees himself as a conservative. He actually sees himself as someone who's pretty liberally minded in a lot of other ways, but he feels that there is an inequality that is being foisted upon white people, and he's setting something straight that is out of skew. And so what he did, if most people probably are not familiar with this man and his history, what he did was he tried to use a young white woman when he was first going. He's brought many cases before the Supreme Court. This has been kind of his life's work at this point. But he brought a young white woman before the Supreme Court, and this was happening, 2008, 2010, and was unsuccessful in bringing a case to the Supreme Court to try to strike down affirmative action and convince them that she somehow was discriminated against in not being able to be admitted to, I think it was University of Texas at Austin, I believe. And that was unsuccessful. So he changed his strategy. Edward Blum is a white man, of course. He changed his strategy and he started to, he sought out an organization of Asian students and used them as his plaintiffs. And ultimately, that was the strategy that was successful in tearing down affirmative action, because they were a much more sympathetic group of people. And the argument was, by using affirmative action and over-admitting Black and Latino students, you are discriminating against these Asian students who are not being admitted to these Ivy League schools at the rate that they should be admitted. So you are causing discrimination against another minority group. So you spoke a little about this earlier, Qasim, but can you kind of talk about that? Because that's it. It does sort of present a little bit of a moral conundrum or an ethical conundrum when we talk about minority students who definitely have test scores that make them worthy to be admitted to these schools. Yet the argument was that they are being discriminated against because of these so-called quotas. So can you speak in general, I guess, about the idea of this white man allying himself with the Asian community to have affirmative action or race-based affirmative action torn down?
And this is again, his argument is just fundamentally not true, right? Because at the end of the day, when you look at the data, the data that I shared earlier on, if anyone is getting, overrepresentation is white students that are 43% are legacy, and 75% of whom would not have qualified otherwise, right? But that's not his objection. He doesn't care about those students. He's focused on the 8% Black students. Two, Asians are still well overrepresented in Ivy League schools by large margins. Asians are not 30% of the US population, but they represent close to 30% of Ivy League schools. And so you can find anecdotes here and there of an Asian student or of any student who thinks that they should have gotten admission. Hell, I thought I should have gotten admission to Harvard. I didn't. Does that mean I was discriminated against? No. Anecdotes don't amount to data. When you look at the data, Asian Americans are still vastly overrepresented based on the population, if that's the metric that you want to go by. But finally, and there's been multiple studies on this, and we can push them out as well, that show that affirmative action actually has immensely benefited Asian students as well. Let's not forget, just 50 years ago, 55 years ago, Asians couldn't immigrate to the United States. Let's not forget, in 1877, there was the anti-Chinese massacre in which 500 Los Angelenos mass murdered 18 Chinese Americans, and no one was held accountable. That massacre led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, re-upped in 1892, re-upped in 1902. It became the Asiatic Exclusion League in 1912. And then a Thin versus United States in 1924, all Asians were banned. And let's not forget the horrific Korematsu decision, which legalized Japanese internment camps, concentration camps for Japanese Americans. And so this idea that because every Asian who applied didn't get admission, therefore Asians are being discriminated against, ignores the fact that Asians are actually overrepresented, ignores the fact that affirmative action also vastly benefited Asian Americans in getting access to the halls of power where none existed before. And it ignores the fact that the only true and meaningful example of unqualified people getting admission are through the legacy admissions programs. Because if your grandfather or great-grandfather or grandparents got into Harvard or Yale during a Jim Crow white supremacy era where non-whites were simply banned from admission, and now that's why you're getting admission, well, then you're directly benefiting from white supremacy. And so I fundamentally reject this notion. The reason why they chose Asian faces is because it was enough to validate to racists that, hey, look, I'm not racist. I'm supporting this one Asian dude. Therefore, I can't possibly be racist. And the fact of the matter remains is it's the Asian version of I have a Black friend, I can't be racist. It doesn't work with a Black friend. It doesn't work with an Asian student either. I always point out to people that, the idea that you can't be racist because you have a Black friend is like saying that you can't be misogynist because you're a man married to a woman. There's no correlation in proximity there. And the data backs up the fact that at the end of the day, affirmative action was vastly beneficial to Asian students. And those Asians who allowed themselves to be scapegoated and become a tool for white supremacy not only hurt themselves, but they hurt future generations of Asian students who otherwise would have had an opportunity but now won't because of their allegiance to white supremacy.
I also want to point out, just in kind of reviewing the facts of this case and looking at some of the news coverage around it, I was really pleasantly surprised to see how many Asians came out in opposition to this and said, hey, we don't want this being done in our name. And this is, we're not okay with this. So I want to go out of my way to say that all Asian people are not in favor of this policy change and how this was done. But then I want to ask too, Qasim, it's like, why are we having this conversation? Why are we discussing this? It's been shot down now through the Supreme Court. what can be done about it. I know that a lot of universities, a lot of Ivy League universities, and many others will follow. They are attempting to rework their admissions policies and now find workarounds to try and figure out how to circumvent these new laws that say that they cannot admit a student using race as a factor. And so, what are some of the ways that universities are trying to work around this? What are some new admissions policies, if you are aware of how they are working around this? How are they? Because it's props to them. Universities like Harvard that are at least conscious of the need to diversify their student body, and they're still trying to figure out ways that they can do this without explicitly asking about race in an application. So what are some of the workarounds that they are finding to be able to create this diversity that they're in search of?
Well, I think there's a long overdue reckoning on how higher education should function. It goes beyond what we're talking about. I mean, we need a reckoning on tuition. We need a reckoning on interest. We need a reckoning on student loans. We need a reckoning on endowments. Why is Harvard sitting on a $50 billion endowment still charging tuition? It's absurd, right? It's become a money-making scheme as opposed to an education, an academia endeavor. And there's also needs to be a reckoning on how students are accepted, because a lot of the strategies that seem neutral are actually grounded in racism, and even if they're not grounded in racism, their effect is to weed out non-wealthy white applicants. I'll give you a couple examples. Universities have an early admission opportunity. Well, if you're low income, then the early admission and the fees that go with that are a very difficult thing. It takes time to come up with those fees. If you don't have those fees, you miss out on early admission, and now you have to be in a more competitive pool later on. If you're low income, having to make a decision a year before when you have financial obligations becomes extraordinarily difficult. I was lucky when I was applying to law school that I was able to scrape together a few dollars. I was on the bubble. I was able to scrape together a few dollars and fly out from Chicago to Richmond to meet with the dean of admissions and beg and plead her to give me admissions, which she did. And she later told me that me flying out there was the decision point that ultimately helped her decide, yeah, I'm serious, I'm committed, I can make it out there. Now, this is not a commentary on my dean of admissions. I'd love her to death, or the university. I'd love the university. But it's a broader point of, if I wasn't able to afford to go out there, I don't get into the law school that's a top tier law school. You look at, LSAT exams and GMAT exams and MCAT exams. If you have the means to hire a tutor to take the $5,000, $10,000 courses, to take those exams and score higher, you're going to have a much higher chance of getting admission. I was so flat broke that I couldn't afford the super expensive LSAT exams. I fortunately had a contact who had taken a test prep course that cost $2,000, and he was kind enough to give it to me for free. And that's how I used to study. And so what a lot of universities are doing is recognizing these issues and are getting rid of the requirement of these standardized tests, because they're not exactly very good indicators of how good of a lawyer you're going to be or how good of a doctor you're going to be anyway. And getting into more decision makings on what kind of work have they been doing, what kind of extracurriculars have they been doing, what kind of commitment do they bring to the table, what is their history? Are they the first person to go to law school? Are they the first person to go to college? And I think that kind of a more holistic approach to me makes a lot more sense. It's a much more well-rounded approach, and it allows universities to make a much more comprehensive decision based on the values that a person brings to the table, as opposed to a standardized test. I don't know if that's going to solve the problem ultimately. I'm a big fan of massive reparations and restitution to harmed communities, particularly African Americans. And until and unless those financial reparations are made, we're not going to actually get closer to solving the problem. But I think we can be head into more of a right direction if we take some of these smaller steps as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a big issue, and I don't know if there any chance, do you feel that there's any chance that affirmative action in some other form might be reinstated? Is there legislation that is being proposed to possibly reintroduce affirmative action in another form? Are there any chances that this will be addressed, I guess, from a legal perspective, or is it now just in the hands of these universities to try and find these workarounds?
I don't know of any legislation to codify affirmative action, especially with this Supreme Court. It'll just get shut down again. I think universities need to play a more active role in this space. They need to play a more active leadership role in this space. And I think that goes back to my earlier comment of the broader conversation on let's stop charging exploitative tuition fees. Let's stop charging exploitative interest rates. Let's make sure that it's accessible and affordable. We recently had tax day, and I was reminded that the IRS estimates that billionaires evade 150 billion in taxes a year. Corporations commit 50 billion in wage theft. That's 200 billion. The Cadillac plan, a free 4-year public college, that pays for tuition, books, room and board, food. The Cadillac plan is $75 billion a year. And so the fact that we have 200 billion just being burned in the pockets of billionaires when 75 billion could solve this problem is an outrage. It's a shameless outrage. And so there are other things that can be done outside of affirmative action that would also enable more equity and access and fairness that aren't being done due to the same remnants of racism and white supremacy that led to the repeal of affirmative action in the first place.
Well, this all starts, I think, with all of us being much more engaged in our communities, much more engaged politically, getting behind candidates like Qasim when they run for office. The change, I guess, the shift, it does start with us. It starts with we, the people. And so the more information that we can arm ourselves with, the better we will be in making sure that we have people that are representing us, that are right-minded. And I know, Qasim, that your future is bright. I know that there's a place for you in the public square. You have so much to offer, so much to say, so much to contribute. I just love listening to you online. Can you tell the folks where they can find you online? How can they plug in with you and what you're doing?
Thank you, Dara. It's such a privilege to converse with like-minded and thoughtful, compassionate leaders like you. Qasim Rashid, Qasim Rashid, at Qasim Rashid across all platforms, and DMs are generally open. And my content is out there. Got my own Sirius XM show as well, which Dara's graciously been part of on multiple occasions, and would love to hear from you. So reach out.
So what channel on Sirius XM?
Channel 126.
Okay.
Urban View. It airs every Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Qasim, for being with us to talk specifically about affirmative action. We are actually going to have Qasim on for a second show on voting rights, the history of voting rights, and the future of voting rights, which is one of my favorite topics. I have some content that's coming out on this topic, and so this will go hand in hand with what I've been discussing lately. So I cannot wait to get into that with you, Qasim. So you all stay tuned for another episode with Qasim Rashid. Thank you so much, Qasim, for your time. I am Dara Star Tucker, and this has been The Breakdown. You all take care of each other, and we will see you at the same time, same place next week. And until then, let's learn to shout.